It all kind of got kicked off when we managed to sequence the first ancient human genome, because that gave us an enormous amount of data from single individuals.
The oldest Viking legend just got scientific proof, but it's stranger than anyone imagined. Genome sequencing shows part of the Viking story is not human. Could the myths be based on real genetic evidence? What does this mean for our history books? Join us as we dive into the secrets buried in Viking DNA. The Viking DNA discovery that changed everything we thought we knew. For a long time, many people have had a consistent idea of what a Viking looked like. Various forms of media like movies, TV shows, comics, and sports team logos have reinforced this image in our minds. The common depiction is of a tall man with long blonde hair, blue eyes, and a strong body. Sometimes this Viking is shown wearing a horned helmet, standing confidently as if he belongs in a modern gym in Scandinavia. This image has been ingrained in our minds for centuries, making it seem accurate and beyond doubt. However, science has now come forward and questioned that familiar image in a significant manner. A large group of scientists recently finished an extensive scientific project that lasted 6 whole years. This was not a small or rushed research. It was a thorough and meticulous investigation aimed at revealing the actual truth about the individuals known as Vikings. The scientists examined the DNA of over 400 Viking skeletons. These remains were not discovered in one single location. They were found in numerous places spread throughout Europe and even Greenland. The objective was simple yet impactful: to comprehend who the Vikings truly were, particularly the individuals who pillaged coastlines and traveled extensively between the years 800 and 1050. The findings from this research were significant enough to be included in the prestigious scientific journal Nature, indicating the credibility and importance of the results. The scientists started their research by looking at the skeleton of a woman named Kata, which was found at a Viking burial site in Varnum, Sweden. Typically, when a skeleton is found at a Viking site in Sweden, it is expected that the DNA will match the traditional Viking genetics. However, when Kata's DNA was examined and compared to others, the results did not align with the expected story. The initial shock came when it was revealed that Vikings were not all blonde as commonly believed. Despite the strong stereotype of blonde Vikings, DNA evidence showed that many actually had brown hair. This goes against the popular media portrayal of bright Nordic Vikings. Their appearance was more diverse and darker than previously thought, contradicting long-held assumptions. This revelation marked the start of challenging centuries-old beliefs about Vikings. Professor Eske Willerslev, who led the study, stated that the genetic makeup of the Viking world was not what people had previously thought. It was commonly believed that Vikings were a homogeneous group of Scandinavians with shared ancestry who conducted raids together. They were generally thought of as a single race of warriors who were united by their bloodlines. However, the DNA findings definitively proved that this notion was inaccurate. The research showed that Vikings interacted with local people more than was previously thought. Their genetic makeup was more varied than expected. Vikings weren't just from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden and only socializing with their own groups. Instead, Vikings had a diverse mix of genetic backgrounds. The discoveries were quite surprising when scientists found genetic markers from southern Europe. It was even more unforeseen to find genetic influences from Asia. What is significant about this is that the foreign DNA in Vikings did not come from only capturing people and bringing them back. The research indicated that this genetic blending occurred earlier, before the Viking era. Genetic exchange from southern Europe and Asia had already occurred in Scandinavia. The discovery challenges the stereotypical image of a purely Scandinavian Viking. It requires a rethinking of the meaning of the word Viking. It also sheds light on interactions in the ancient world. The genetic links indicate that people were traveling and mingling over vast distances much earlier than previously believed. This occurred long before modern modes of transportation. There were no planes, trains, or convenient travel paths. Nevertheless, Asian genes managed to enter the Viking gene pool. This implies that the world was more interconnected than commonly thought. Scandinavia was not a remote, frozen land separated from the rest of the world. It was more like a central location where various groups of people traveled, lived, and interacted. The discovery alters the definition of the term Viking. The DNA proof indicates that being a Viking was not based on genetics. It was not determined by bloodline. Instead, being a Viking was a job or occupation. It was about what you did, not your family history. So, if being a Viking was a job, it meant anyone from different backgrounds could become a Viking. This raises further questions about Viking society. How did they remain organized if they weren't all the same? How did they manage to conquer and rule over such vast territories? The evidence from DNA indicates that they valued skills in their society. If an individual could fight, travel, and contribute, they were welcomed. This implies a social system that was more open and adaptable than was previously thought. Nevertheless, this causes a different question to be raised. Why is the perception of the blonde, blue-eyed Viking still prevalent if Vikings were genetically diverse? One explanation could be that the blonde Vikings were a minority who were influential or had high social status. Another theory is that this image was fabricated at a later point and magnified over time to portray Vikings as more heroic and mythical than they truly were. The research also discovered an unexpected aspect of Scandinavia. It demonstrated that Viking groups in different regions were genetically separate from each other. Vikings from Norway did not interact much with Vikings from Sweden, as they were distinct groups and sometimes even enemies. When Vikings were made and a dark turn in Britain, this Scottish mystery sheds new light on the true meaning of the word Viking. It suggests that being a Viking wasn't just about bloodline, but more about cultural influence. Viking culture seemed to spread like a powerful idea, embraced by those who recognized its strength. Previously, it was commonly believed that being a Viking was determined at birth. If you were born in Norway, you were automatically considered a Viking. However, recent evidence indicates that it was not as straightforward as that. Researchers examined 2 skeletons discovered in Orkney, Scotland. The people buried them with care and respect, following Viking customs. The bodies were laid out in a boat-like burial, representing the belief that their souls would go to Valhalla. They were buried with Viking swords, showing their high status. The graves indicated that the individuals were likely Norse warriors. Scientists have long believed that these men were Scandinavian invaders based on their findings. The DNA test results came in, and they completely altered the situation. The results revealed no Scandinavian ancestry at all. There was no connection to Norway, Denmark, or Sweden. Instead, the men had genetic ties to the people of Ireland and Scotland. It's possible they were descendants of the Picts, the enigmatic ancient Scottish tribe. Despite their Scottish roots, they lived and were buried as Vikings. The finding shows something important. Being a Viking was not about being a specific ethnicity, but about adopting a certain identity. It was like being part of a shared culture or a well-known social group. People didn't have to have Scandinavian ancestry to be considered a Viking. They just had to embrace the Viking way of life. The locals witnessed the arrival of the Vikings and were impressed by their strength, ships, weapons, and success. They admired the effective system the Vikings had and decided to become part of it. They started following Viking traditions, using Viking tools, believing in Viking customs, and possibly even speaking the Viking language. While their physical appearance may indicate one thing, their burial practices suggest something else. This new understanding changes the way we see the history of the British Isles. The traditional view often depicts Vikings fighting against locals. It simplifies the past as a battle between attackers and defenders. However, the DNA evidence reveals a much more intricate and dynamic picture. The boundaries were not set in stone, and locals were not always fighting back. Some actually decided to join the Viking community. The Viking influence was not just about genetics, but also about social and political developments. They brought new ideas, technology, and a strong sense of identity that even their enemies found attractive. During the same time that mixing of cultures was occurring in Scotland, disturbing events were unfolding in southern England. One of the most unsettling findings from the Viking era is the headless men of Dorset. In Dorset, archaeologists found a mass grave that held around 50 skeletons, all of which were decapitated. Mass graves usually indicate a tragedy, but this discovery was particularly shocking due to the absence of heads on every body. This was not a burial from a battle. The marks on the neck bones indicate a clear sequence of events. The wounds suggest that these men were not executed in a battle. Instead, they were captured, tied up, and executed in order. This was a planned massacre. Some of these bodies were part of the same DNA analysis, which revealed more tragic details about the past. The DNA testing confirmed that these men were indeed of Viking descent. They were not local people pretending to be Vikings. They were authentic Scandinavian raiders. They were probably part of a raiding group that was unsuccessful in their mission. They were captured by local forces, possibly Anglo-Saxons, and executed far from their own lands. This finding makes us consider the Viking era more truthfully. Commonly, the focus is on burning down villages and stealing treasure. However, this burial site illustrates the consequence of failure. It shows 50 men who were likely acquainted with each other, possibly friends, relatives, or companions, standing in a row and executed without any mercy. The DNA results showed that these men were not all from the same region in Scandinavia. They were not from one specific village or family. Instead, their genetics indicated they came from various parts of Scandinavia. This suggests that they were a group of men recruited for their skills, rather than being related by blood. Just like how pirate crews operated, Viking crews were made up of fighters from different areas, brought together by leaders based on their abilities and loyalty, rather than their specific background. This information backs up a bigger trend. Viking groups were adaptable and welcoming when it came to bringing in new members. As long as someone met the criteria and had similar goals, they could become a part of the group. This trend also shows how people from different regions, such as in Scotland and Scandinavia, could come together and fight alongside each other in the Viking world. This mass grave could be linked to a dark event in history called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In the year 1002, the English king Ethelred the Unready commanded the murder of Danes residing in England. The DNA evidence lines up with this time frame. Although we can't be completely sure, this possibility gives more significance to the finding. When all of these parts come together, a powerful picture emerges. Viking forces weren't just typical armies connected to one specific region or family. They were more like a foreign military in the early medieval times. They were varied, able to move easily, and able to adjust to new situations. This variety might be why they were successful. They were able to learn fast, upgrade their weapons when necessary, and take in new information if it improved their chances of survival. They combined different cultures, talents, and even individuals. In the West, violence and cultural mixing were changing the landscape, but in the East, a different Viking tale was unfolding. While Danish Vikings were facing harsh consequences in England, Swedish Vikings were making their way through Russia. They were gaining strength through different methods. Their travels eastward raised an interesting question in Viking history. Could these warriors have become elite guards for a distant emperor? When Swedish Vikings turned east and changed the genetic map, it is known that the Vikings were not all one united group, but rather connected by culture and language. They had different journeys and goals. The Danes traveled west, the Norwegians went northwest, and the Swedes headed east. The eastern movement of the Swedes is where we see an Asian DNA connection emerge. Genetic research has revealed that Swedish Vikings had a distinctive genetic lineage compared to other Viking communities. Their way of life was not solely defined by raids and warfare. Trade also played a significant role in shaping their identity and lifestyle. Swedish Vikings utilized their longships to traverse the Baltic Sea, allowing them to access the extensive river networks in present-day Russia and Ukraine. These rivers were not narrow passages, but rather expansive waterways teeming with prospects for the Vikings. The Swedish Vikings sailed down the Dnieper River and the Volga River, which were important trade routes connecting northern Europe to the ancient world. As they traveled, the Swedish Vikings adopted a new name for themselves, the Rus. The name Rus eventually evolved into the modern name Russia. Genetic research indicates that the early rulers of Russia were of Viking descent, which reshapes our understanding of European history. When people agree on the idea that Vikings moved east, a new question arises. How far east did they go? Historical records prove that they made it to Constantinople, a powerful ancient city, and Baghdad, an important trade hub. There is also physical evidence, like Viking carvings in the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, showing their presence in these faraway places. genetic evidence has revealed an unexpected discovery. Viking Age skeletons in Scandinavia contain Asian DNA. This finding suggests that either the Vikings journeyed to Asia or Asians traveled to Scandinavia to meet the Vikings. This indicates that the Viking world was more interconnected than previously thought. To comprehend how blending occurred, it's useful to examine the Silk Road. This historic trade route connected China and Europe, serving as a major transportation route. People traded spices, silk, silver, ideas, and even themselves along this path. The Vikings positioned themselves on the western frontier of this extensive network. Merchants from Central Asia, such as those from the steppe areas, and potentially early predecessors of Mongol tribes, may have journeyed through river routes and engaged with Viking settlements. The genetic research backs up this concept. DNA evidence shows that Asian genes can be found in the remains of Scandinavians from the Viking era. This suggests that individuals from the East were not only far-off trading partners, but actually lived among the Vikings. They integrated into Viking society through living, marrying, and becoming members of the community. Places like the market in Kiev would have been diverse, with Viking traders trading furs for Arab silver alongside merchants from Central Asia. These markets were true melting pots of different cultures, languages, and family lineages. The blending of different groups of people leads to an interesting theory. It could provide insight into the intense rage displayed by Viking warriors known as berserkers. These warriors were believed to go into a kind of trance during battles where they felt no pain and displayed incredible strength and endurance. This behavior has been linked to the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, but some researchers propose there may be other factors at play. One idea suggests that the intense physical and mental state of Viking warriors may have been influenced by genetics. When two different populations intermingle, new characteristics can emerge, a phenomenon known as hybrid vigor. The combination of the robust Scandinavian body type and the resilience of steppe populations could have led to unique physical capabilities. These new genetic mixtures might have played a role in the exceptional endurance and strength of Viking warriors. This suggests that Vikings were not solely Scandinavian in terms of their genetic makeup, as their strength could have been derived from a diverse blend of human genes. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople was a prime example of Viking diversity. The Byzantine emperor opted to use Vikings for protection instead of local soldiers, as they were not involved in local politics and only cared about their payment. The Vikings hired became the emperor's elite personal guard. The Varangian Guard members were famous for being large, strong, and carrying huge axes. They also had a mix of different genetic backgrounds. Being in Constantinople put them in a central position in the world. They resided with people from various ethnicities like Greeks, Turks, Africans, and Asians. Their time in Constantinople was lengthy, with many Vikings staying for years. After completing their service, they went back to Scandinavia, bringing their families along. This trend describes a different genetic discovery. During this era, Scandinavian populations showed traces of Southern European DNA. This was not the result of invasions from the south, but rather because Vikings would bring individuals back with them. They essentially brought people from around the world to the north. Their lands became hubs of international interaction. However, this willingness to interact with others brings about a puzzling question. Despite being highly interconnected and receptive to outside influences, why did Viking culture decline over time? According to genetic research, this extensive cultural exchange took place prior to and during the Viking era. How far did the Vikings really go? We are certain that the Vikings made it to Newfoundland. This is supported by the archaeological site at Lanzo Meadows, which proves that Norse people traveled across the Atlantic and landed in North America. The uncovering of this historical site has had a significant impact on our understanding of the past. Many experts think that Lanzo Meadows was not intended to be a permanent settlement, but rather a temporary resting place or a spot for repairing ships before continuing their journey. This raises the question of how far the Vikings may have traveled beyond Newfoundland. Stories have been told in the Americas about fair-skinned, bearded men coming before the Spanish for a while. These tales are found in different versions in various areas and among different groups of people. These strangers were typically seen as unusual travelers who came by sea. Historians have often rejected these stories as myths or misinterpretations, because there was no concrete evidence to support them. Instead, they were considered more like folklore than actual history. However, recent findings are making people reconsider these theories, particularly in light of new information on Viking DNA. Recent genetic research has revealed that the Vikings were not a homogeneous group, but rather a mix of people with different backgrounds, including some with Asian heritage. This new finding changes our understanding of the Viking world and prompts questions about their abilities. Without magnetic compasses, how did they navigate long journeys over open seas? One suggestion is that they used sunstones, crystals that could locate the sun even on cloudy days by detecting polarized light. Although this may seem strange, it is rooted in actual scientific principles. Some view this as advanced technology, while others prefer to explain it within the realm of existing science. If the Vikings had the skills to navigate well and were able to adjust to new places due to their genetic makeup, it is worth wondering if they could have explored more of the American coast. The Kensington runestone found in Minnesota is a debated item that suggests Swedish and Norwegian Vikings were in North America in 1362. Many experts believe it is a fraud. However, with recent genetic studies revealing the extensive travels and intermingling of Vikings with other groups, some scholars think the artifact should be re-examined. This brings up another important question. If Vikings from Sweden brought Asian DNA to Scandinavia, is it possible that Vikings from Norway left European DNA in Native American populations? While extensive genetic studies have not shown clear Viking genetic traits in pre-Columbian Native American remains, the lack of evidence doesn't definitively rule out the possibility. It could just mean that the evidence hasn't been discovered yet, or that researchers are searching in the wrong locations. Another idea that is often overlooked is the possibility that Vikings may have brought people back with them instead of just leaving their DNA behind in the Americas. Picture a Viking ship coming back from Vinland with people on board, not just treasure. If Native Americans were brought to Iceland or Norway, their DNA would eventually mix in with the local population. As time passed, it would be more challenging to track, but it wouldn't vanish. In Iceland, researchers have found a genetic clue that supports the idea of Native American ancestry. They discovered a specific type of genetic lineage called cone E, which is commonly found in Native American and Asian populations. While this genetic type is only present in a small number of Icelandic families, the timeline suggests it may have arrived around 1,000 years ago. This raises the question, did a Viking bring a Native American woman back to Iceland around the year 1000? The evidence available seems to support this explanation more than others. The Amazon theory is seen as the most extreme theory of all. Some researchers believe that ancient images in South America depict men with beards. While Vikings are known for their beards, this link is not strong enough on its own. However, when considering other Viking skills, the theory becomes more intriguing. Vikings were skilled in river travel and used rivers to reach inland areas, including those linked to Baghdad through trade routes. If it was possible in Europe and Asia, why would the Amazon River be any different? The concept may seem unlikely, but new findings have shown that we underestimated the Vikings in the past. It has been revealed that Vikings actually had Asian genes before they were recognized as Vikings. Additionally, individuals from Scotland also joined the Viking community. The Viking identity was more of a collective system or franchise rather than a specific ethnic group. Taking this into consideration, the theory about the Vikings reaching the Amazon seems less ridiculous and more worthy of discussion. When mythology is brought into the conversation, it becomes more complex. Norse mythology features tales of a battle between two sets of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir represent war and strength, with gods like Odin and Thor. Meanwhile, the Vanir are connected to nature, fertility, and the earth, with deities like Freyr and Freyja. In the past, scholars saw this conflict as only symbolic, but there are different ways to interpret it. What if this story is based on a true historical and genetic occurrence? Could it be that the Vanir represent the first people of Scandinavia, who had ancestors from southern Europe? And maybe the Aesir symbolizes new groups with ancestry from the Asian steppe? In the legend, the war doesn't result in destruction, but in integration. In the end, the time when Vikings intermingled with other cultures ended, Research on genetics shows that the introduction of new genes decreased and eventually stopped. The dynamic Viking society became more stable, with Denmark, Sweden, and Norway forming separate nations. The reasons for this change are not completely understood. It is possible that the church limited the movement of people, political boundaries became more defined, or the Viking lifestyle lost its appeal. However, the genetic material of the Vikings did not disappear. It continued to exist in the population, although not visibly. This returns to the ultimate question, which is very personal and has not been answered yet. It is waiting to be addressed with evidence that is yet to be discovered. The Viking legacy, written in our DNA. Let's put everything together and see what all this thorough research really means for people today. The scientists didn't just study old graves and bones, they also compared ancient Viking DNA with modern populations. Their aim was straightforward yet impactful, to determine how much of the Viking genetic lineage still exists after over 1,000 years of change, migration, and historical events. The findings are unexpected and have a lot of importance. If you're currently residing in the United Kingdom, it's very likely that you have Viking heritage. Research indicates that as many as 6% of the UK residents have considerable Viking genes. This implies that there are millions of individuals today who have genetic evidence of those who sailed across cold seas in longboats. Someone could have a job in an office, be a teacher, or work in a hospital, and still have a piece of the North Sea in their DNA. Researchers found that in Sweden, the percentage of people with distinct Viking genetic markers is even greater, around 10%. Some might think this number is low, considering the common belief that modern Swedes are mostly Viking in terms of ancestry. However, a recent study actually disputes this notion. It reveals that modern Scandinavians do not share the same genetic makeup as the Vikings from a millennium ago. Throughout the centuries, there has been a significant change in the gene pool. The distinct genetic characteristics of the Vikings, which included influences from Scandinavia, Southern Europe, and Asia, have evolved, diminished, or merged into something new. This finding changes how we see history. It proves that people are always changing due to time, migration, and evolution. You can't assume a modern Swedish individual is exactly like a Viking. The past doesn't immobilize people, it alters and molds them. As a result, historians will have to revise their old theories and modernize established beliefs. The research disproves the notion of pure ancestry. Some groups claim Viking heritage to represent genetic purity, but science proves otherwise. Vikings were actually very genetically diverse and mixed. They didn't keep to themselves and integrated with other populations wherever they went. They embraced new cultures, skills, and DNA. Their resilience came from their diversity, not uniformity. When looking at the remains discovered in places like Orkney, it becomes more evident that not all individuals buried as Vikings were actually Scandinavian. Some were locals who embraced the Viking lifestyle. This demonstrates that being a Viking was not necessarily based on ancestry, but on involvement in activities like sailing, fighting, and working towards common objectives. If someone could partake in these activities, they could be accepted into the Viking group. The study also shows how extensive Viking exploration was. Their genetic material proves that they were constantly on the move. They journeyed from Denmark to England, Norway to Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, and Sweden to the Baltic areas. These paths created a large interconnected network spanning continents. Vikings essentially served as mediators between different parts of the medieval world, joining distant areas before advanced communication methods were developed. However, the research shows a surprising sudden decrease in the influx of new genes into Scandinavia around the end of the Viking Age, which was approximately in the year 1050. This meant that the genetic diversity that characterized the Viking era significantly decreased. Borders, both physical and genetic, became more defined as the free movement of genes in the Viking world diminished. Multiple factors could be contributing to this change. The spread of Christianity brought in new beliefs and norms that discouraged raiding and the slave trade, both of which were major factors in the mingling of cultures in the past. Additionally, powerful kingdoms began to emerge, leading to the centralization of power. Areas that were once open and accessible became more restricted and fortified.